Is GPU technology ready for production rendering? That's what we'll discover by the end of this video. For many years, CPU-based computing has been the preferred method for advanced production rendering in the VFX industry. This is due to the CPU's efficiency and the high production quality of its rendered outputs. However, with advances in today's GPU technologies, it may be beneficial for VFX studios to adopt GPU-based rendering solutions. If GPU technology can be utilized to speed up the rendering process, then VFX companies could push for even more realistic renders and dedicate more time to research and development and pre-production. Rendering is essentially the process of approximating how light reacts within a 3D environment. In the real world, light is complex and does some strange things. Properly modeling the properties of light and how it interacts with materials in a 3D environment is complicated, which creates limitations. These rendered limitations include important effects such as reflections, refractions, ambient lighting, subsurface scattering, translucency, soft shadows, depth of field, motion blur, fog, clouds, and many more. The electrical architecture of the GPU makes it perfect for crunching the raw numbers that are needed to approximate the properties of light. On the other hand, the CPU's electrical architecture allows it to more accurately reproduce how light interacts with its environment, thus overcoming nearly all render limitations. Essentially, the GPU is faster than the CPU, but lacks the ability to efficiently and accurately overcome many of the render limitations. This simple scene includes a single V-Ray light, two objects, and a basic reflective material. Using the V-Ray render engine, the scene was rendered 3 times using 3 different render methods. The first method utilized the CPU, the second method utilized the GPU in OpenCL mode, and the third method utilized the GPU in CUDA mode. Something worth noting is that when rendering with the CPU, the user starts the render and waits until the frame has completed rendering the whole image until it reaches its maximum quality. In contrast, when using the 2 GPU methods, the user tells the render engine how long to progressively calculate the image. If the user sets the time too low, then the quality of the rendered image will be negatively affected. For the sake of comparison, the time allowed for both GPU methods was set to roughly the same time it took for the CPU method to finish rendering. When comparing the CPU render with the OpenCL GPU render, it is obvious that the OpenCL GPU render contains much more noise in the reflections and refractions. To overcome this issue, the OpenCL GPU render would need more time to compute, thus making it slower than the CPU rendering method. But when comparing the CPU render with the CUDA GPU render, the difference in quality is less noticeable. The CUDA GPU render does have slightly more noise than the CPU render, but it did a better job of calculating the caustics with no additional change in render settings. The caustic settings in the CPU render were not touched, and in reality, these settings should be changed to more accurately replicate the caustics effect. This complex scene includes multiple V-Ray lights, a little over 60 objects, and a mix of basic and complex materials. Apart from the complexity of the scene, the processes were the same as when creating the rendered images for the simple scene. And just like the simple scene, this scene was rendered 3 times using 3 different rendering methods. The first method utilized the CPU, The second method utilized the GPU in OpenCL mode, and the third method utilized the GPU in CUDA mode. The most noticeable difference when comparing the CPU render with the two GPU renders is the drastic difference in time. While it took the CPU render roughly 21 minutes to fully render, both the OpenCL and CUDA GPU renders only took 9 minutes to fully render. It is easy to see why GPU rendering technology is such a hot topic, with its ability to cut down render times in half. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as it may appear. If we look at the grapes, we can see that in each image they appear different. This is because a subsurface scatter material was applied to the grapes in order to emulate how light reacts with multiple layers found in organic objects such as fruit and skin. In the CPU render, the light is most accurately scattered through the subsurface scattering material, but in the OpenCL GPU render, the subsurface scattering material shows up completely black except for some reflections that appear on the grapes. In the CUDA GPU render, the GPU does a decent job of approximating how that light would interact with the subsurface scatter material, but when compared to the CPU render, the subsurface scattering effect is less than convincing. Although GPU rendering is usually faster than CPU rendering, that is not always the case 100% of the time. The type of scene that's being rendered has a big hand in determining if the GPU will render faster or slower than the CPU. Typically, the GPU's fast render times are used to aid digital artists in the pre-production phase, allowing artists to get a quick and fairly close representation of how lights and materials look within the scene before creating the final high-quality render. Furthermore, the GPU's lack of support for specific features like subsurface scattering is detrimental to its implementation as a production render technology. Many of these features that are not supported by GPU rendering technologies are critical in creating realistic renders and highly sophisticated visual effects. Even with its advancements, GPU technology still lacks many features that CPU-based rendering can offer for production rendering. After comparing the speed and quality of CPU and GPU rendering technologies in both a simple and complex scene, it is clear that GPU technology has greatly improved over the decades. However, CPU rendering remains the more effective of the two methods, especially when creating production quality renders. As for now, the GPU is a great tool for real-time tasks, such as creating a quick preview render to gauge a scene's lighting and materials, before rendering the scene at full production quality. It is highly possible that in the next 5 to 10 years, GPU rendering solutions will be the standard rendering technology in a production setting, but currently, CPU remains on top. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.